Good evening. I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, we've been talking about this issue of this interface between Christianity and medicine for about 35 years, so it's been going on for a while, and I appreciate Jenny Pfister covering the last 6 weeks while I was out of the country in the Philippines. And now we are back, and it's good to be back, and we're going to be talking about some of the experiences that we've had in the Philippines and what's happening in Asia and in Christianity and in medicine, continuing this interface. I thought as opening up, since we are into March weather, and sometimes it's a lion and sometimes it's a lamb, we talk about March storms. And our theme song mentions tender loving care, soothing as a springtime rain. Sometimes the rain is soothing, sometimes the wind is blowing harsh. But I wanted to talk about storms today, particularly because in the Philippines, the 7,200 Allens, the relatives I visited and the folks in the Philippines respect storms and are perhaps closer to storms than we are here in West Virginia. And to the impact of storms on our lives. Though, just as I was preparing for this program tonight, I was listening to the news and heard the announcement that the Statue of Liberty is opening for today for the first time since last October, when the superstorm Sandy came through. If you remember this, a big storm, and hit New York City and damaged the island, Liberty Island, and Lady Liberty was okay, but it was not safe to get on and off the island, and so now it's opening up after all this months and months of repair. So I say that only to make an announcement by way of storms impact our lives here too, don't they? And they can disrupt us. The other thing that's happened in the past year about storms is the derecho that occurred last June the 29th, and I wasn't here at that time, but folks that were said they've never experienced anything like that, almost like a 100-mile-per-hour wind coming directly at them, and it was a widespread phenomenon. Almost all of West Virginia was involved. It was coming out of Ohio, and just like a giant storm. Never heard of the term derecho before, but we all know about it now, and most of us were without power for about 9 days. And I had personal friends and others who suffered a great deal because of that. Some people losing all their food supply, some people dependent on medical equipment for breathing, sleeping, and so forth, needing to get generators, and all sorts of things happening because of that superstorm derecho, and not to mention the superstorm Sandy, which came through here in October, and then that blizzard hit West Virginia, and we had another 9 or 10 days without electricity. So storms impact us here in West Virginia. The other way to open this up would be that we become afraid at times of storm. And I am aware of this as I still do contract work with the VA, and I get a chance to examine soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and many of them are struck by the severity of the storms that they encounter overseas, the sandstorms that are horrible. We don't really think about that, almost like a tornado or a hurricane of sand, and that can be very devastating. Of course, equipment can malfunction, all sorts of bad things happen if they get jammed up with particles of sand. And our soldiers have had to fight under those conditions. And so we ask, when we do an exam of a soldier, is there something that's happened to you in the environment or in your psychosocial life that's impacted you, separate, if you will, from combat stress or other medical issues that they have, but the environment and the psychosocial life that they live impacts their health in big ways. This first came to the attention, and maybe no surprise since I've been in the Philippines, and General Douglas MacArthur practically lived in the Philippines after World War I, and then leading up to World War II, and then he became the supreme Allied commander fighting the Japanese. But his headquarters for years and years was in the Manila Hotel in the Philippines, downtown Manila. This was leading up to World War II. And he's very familiar with the typhoons and the storms. And so when we began to fight in the World War II in the Pacific Rim and fighting all the way to Japan, he was well aware of the storms. In fact, he went to his doctors and he said, I want you to screen out people who have had severe environmental or psychosocial event in the past year. And he gave them examples, of devastating fires, floods, accidents, the death of a mother, all these things that happen and we don't think of commonly, but he thought about it. And so that became the staging ground for talking about stress and disease. General Douglas MacArthur and his experience in the Philippines. Well, I want to hone down to what I learned this time while in the Philippines. We went primarily to attend a relative's wedding, and then Rastley and I have been involved for 33 years now with a Bible school, and of course we wanted to be involved in that ministry again while we were over there, and we got to do many things with the Bible students, and we'll share that with you over time too. But the wedding part, I had the privilege of being asked by the couple to offer the invocation, the prayer for their wedding. And I consider that a high privilege. And so I turned to my niece and nephews, Gina's children. Gina went to high school with us here and stayed in Buchanan, graduated from Buchanan Upshur High School in the 80s. And now she's married and she has 3 of her own children. And so I asked Gabriel and Alexandra and Gray, the 3 children, to help me with the prayer. And I thought it would be fascinating to do that. And it was. And I learned a lot from children. I'm fascinated by how children think and their creativity and their reasoning. And I said, what should we include in our prayer? And they said, well, we know the story. We want this couple to be safe from the storms of life. And he said, we want to include the Bible verse, the Bible story from Mark, the 4th chapter of Mark, where Jesus quiets the storm. It's an important thing to include in the prayer. And it is because of all the storms they have in the Philippines and the children's own experience. But let me share with you the story, and then it will allow us to talk a little bit more about storms and faith and health, of course. This is Mark, the 4th chapter, beginning in the 35th verse. I'll just use the NIV version to tell the story here. Jesus was ministering, and that evening the day was closing down, and he said, let's go over to the other side of the Lake of Galilee, and let's leave the crowd behind. And so they got in a boat, and there was a furious squall came up. The waves were breaking over the boat. It was filling up with water, and it was nearly swamped. And lo and behold, Jesus was very tired. Remember now, he was ministering all day long, healing people, and that takes a lot out of people. One time, you know the story, a different story, but a lady in a crowd touches the hem of his garment and is healed of bleeding, 12 years of bleeding. And Jesus is aware and said, who touched me? Of course, the disciples said, well, everyone's touching you. You're in a crowd. And they said, no, someone's been healed. Something has come out of me. An energy, and so the lady came forward and identified herself. But Jesus had been ministering all day long, as I'm sure he was very tired. And anyway, this furious squall came up, and the waves were breaking over the boat, and it was nearly swamping, and Jesus was asleep. He was asleep on a cushion, it says. And the disciples woke him up and said, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And he got up and he rebuked the wind and said to it, Peace, be still. And the wind died down and was completely calm. His disciples said, and he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And of course they were amazed that even the storm, even the winds and the waves obey him. He said, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And it's a fascinating story, isn't it? Just tucked in there, primarily Mark's gospel, and naturally it attracted the children's attention. They probably had studied that in their Sunday school lessons, but certainly their experience of storms has been very involved in the Philippines. Sometimes the typhoons come and lift the grass off the huts, and you're exposed to the wind and the rain. Of course, it rains for about 6 months. There's a rainy season, and then there's a dry season, which rains every day on the dry season, once or twice a day, but little bits of rain, and then it clears up. It's sunny. So they're used to rain and storms a lot, and they're very taken by this verse, "Peace, be still," Jesus quieting the storm. And so as we developed our prayer, we were able to then talk about that and pray about that, and include the fact that Jesus would protect this young couple, Mark Anthony Gannon, a nephew of mine, and Joy Pimentel, a doctor who's a specialist in OBGYN, and Mark and Joy are now married successfully, and we prayed for their marriage, and of course that the storms of life would not overtake them, that God would protect them, Jesus would calm the storm. Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, to be involved in storms, to realize that the Statue of Liberty has been closed all these months since Superstorm Sandy because of the storm, devastating storm to the northeast, and of course our power was off here, the Direcco last summer. Storms can be very bad. Well, there's several other stories of storms in the Bible, and where storms have been used, if you will, by God in various ways, and it's certainly been appreciated by people, incorporated into the Bible. In the Acts, the 27th chapter, Paul has staked everything to defend himself before Caesar. Not because he couldn't be dismissed, because he was being falsely charged and not given a fair trial as a Roman citizen. So he didn't really have to appeal clear to Caesar. He could have been cleared earlier, but he saw an opportunity for ministry if he could go to Rome, the very seat of power, and defend himself as a Roman citizen. Of course, if he lost, he would die, and he knows the risk, but he felt he would win, and so he's on a boat. He's on a boat in the 27th chapter of Acts, going to Rome from the Holy Land, and it's winter. And in the Philippines, they have 3 levels of storms, and I'm sure they have a recognition of this in the Mediterranean too, or anywhere. If you went to New England, they probably would tell you there are 3 categories of storms. Of course, there's the rain and the storm that you can go out in with your boat and you can be safe. It's just a normal storm. We're going to have some normal storms in West Virginia here in March. Spring rains are coming, and that's fine. The second level of storm is coming up. It may be more ferocious. If you're a sailor, if you have a ship, you're not going to go out to sea because your ship may capsize. Jesus, in the story here on his boat, the fishing boat, the squall came up and it was furious, and they were taking on water. They were going to capsize, and so therefore people don't go out in those storms if they can think about it. And so here in this case, in Paul's story, they take port for the winter, and they're going to. I'm looking to tell the little town Malta, I think, but anyway, they're trying to get to a port for the winter, and but they decide that perhaps it's not a very big harbor, and it may not protect them, and they want to go on to Phoenix. They want to go on to Phoenix, another the old Phoenix. We have Phoenix, Arizona, but this would be the Phoenix in the Mediterranean, to a bigger port and spend the winter there. So there are that type of storms where people know the storm's coming and they just refuse to go out to sea. The sailors know it's not safe. Anything can happen, and they respect that. And then, of course, there are the major storms that blow up that no one knows they're coming. Maybe they can't be predicted, and people are caught, and it's total devastation. Now, I'm not preaching tonight, but I'm talking about storms per se, but obviously the storms can be an attack of the devil, can it? I mean, you could make something out of that in a biblical sense. And of course, God, Jesus, quieted the storm, peace be still. And so it's a spiritual action can overcome storms also. Well, let's talk a little bit about this, about Paul's experience. If he was, they were going to, they got caught up in this storm on the way to Phoenix, and they're going to sink. And in fact, they do sink. But Paul has a spiritual experience. He has an angel come to him, according to the scriptures in the 27th chapter, in the 12th verse there, beginning there, and forward to 21 through 26. There's the story of this interaction with an angel, and the angel says, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you, and all those who sail with you. So take heart, men. I have faith," Paul said, "in God. It's going to be exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on some island." So he knew ahead that all 270 some sailors on his ship, is a big ship, were all going to be saved, and he was going to make it to Rome. But even though a disaster is looming, he said, we have to go into the storm. We have to face it. We're going to have to get to land. We're going to have to crash the ship, but we're all going to survive. And that's a promise. That's a promise. And we have that. Jesus even said to his disciples, didn't he? He said when they were taking on water, they said, "Don't you care that we drown?" And Jesus said, "You of little faith." Or, where is your faith? You know we can survive. God can do anything. This is where the children are, I think, were ahead of me in the Philippines when they wanted to talk about the storm as a part of a prayer. We're going to try to have a blessing for the wedding, and the children know that there'll be storms of life and that there'll be horrible things could happen out of storms. But they were going to exercise their faith that God is going to take care of it. God's going to say, "Peace, be still," and everything's going to be okay. So when you think about this, Paul does go aground. The ship does crash, and he does make it to Rome, just as the angel predicted, just as God predicted. But we have storms in our own life, and I'll go back to General Douglas MacArthur and to the World War II, and we have warnings of things happening, and in some sense, being in the Philippines now and then looking at America from a distance, we're facing big storms of our own. Our economy's not in good shape. Our educational system is in West Virginia. We're struggling with that. The legislature is debating that while I've been overseas, and I'm get back in the fray, back in the storm now as a school board member. That's we're 49th in many measurements out of 50. We've got a lot of storm work to do there to improve that, and then we have the whole other issue, and I would just, it's a drug issue, I think, is the best way to say that. Trying to look at our newspaper, if you've ever tried to catch up on a newspaper and read 6 weeks of newspapers all at once, you see certain patterns, but over and over again, arrest for drug offenses, people going to serve time. They've been convicted for drug offenses, drug bust, and various things happening, and then bad things happening to children because of drugs. And so we've got some storms. We've got some storms coming that way just with drugs. And one person that I respect said, "We're lost." And I'm sure the disciples felt that way, that when they had their storm, that they were going to sink. The squall was going to take them. It was furious, and that they were going to sink at sea and drown. And so this lady, not because I don't question her faith, but her reality check on this was, we're lost. We're in trouble. We're in too much trouble. But what can get us out of it? And I'm always a hopeful person. This is a program called Tender Loving Care. I think the getting back to our foundations, getting back to our anchor, but getting back to our roots. I think we have lost some common sense. Everything has to slow down. I don't look at the cycle of business as a bad thing. When people have to stay in their own house and not move to a bigger house or go into more debt, pay off the debts they have, then that's not a bad thing. People have to get together as a family, learn how to do things, fun things that are free. We have wonderful parks in West Virginia. This might be the year to just do the state parks, not take an extravagant vacation out of state. This is the year to do gardens. We have fertile soil. We have nice rains that give us a water supply. Many parts of the nation had droughts this past year, but we have good. An article in the paper said the little bit of a drought we had last year is about gone. I mean, the water table is back up to where it should be because of the rain. We can put out gardens and raise gardens, and that's a family activity that teaches about survival, teaches about planning ahead, and people getting by. Just as the pioneers did when they came here. But people have given up gardens over the past 25 years, but we can go back to things like that. Someone once said to me, looking at all the churches in Upshur County, said, well, we have an awful lot of churches. And then as this conversation went on, someone said, well, if everyone in the county, 22,000 people or so, wanted to go to church, would there be a seat for everyone? And probably not. So we may not even have enough churches, but church is an activity that people can go back to. Our communities have been founded in that, and when there's storms of life, that's a good place to go. That's a good port in a storm, is to be in a church. Just as Paul was getting into the port of Phoenix, just as in the Philippines, these children, the nieces and nephews were getting into the port of Ajongan, seeking a port. So the church is a port. So there are different things that are happening. You can, when you step back one step away from West Virginia, United States, we're in for a big storm. It's a prediction that we could count on. Let me say also that in the face of a storm, no one should ever give up. If you are employed, stay employed. I mean, don't run for the hills. We had I remember when we had 9/11, which was a huge attack on America. This has happened only with Pearl Harbor and then 9/11. So doesn't happen very often. But I was running a clinic at the VA, and the patients that I was scheduled to have come see me that day were calling in and saying, and I was answering the phone, and they were saying, Doc, I'm not coming in today. I'm taking my guns. I'm going up in the hills. I'm going to defend my family. This is a big storm. I'm not coming. I'm not going to drive to the VA. I'm not going to leave my farm. I'm not going to leave my family. But we have to be prepared. But if you're in the midst of life, and you have a job, you have a home, and so forth, this is the time to buckle down and work with your own family, and not abandon what works for you. Likewise, when it comes to prayer, I always liked Abraham Lincoln's thought that God helps those who help themselves. And I watched the movie Lincoln, as I'm sure many of you all did last fall, and I've read about Lincoln. I'm not sure he actually said that, but it's attributed to Lincoln. It makes sense, doesn't it, that God helps those who help themselves? It's something that Lincoln would say. And he was our president during a massive storm, the Civil War. We've never had anything like that before. Hopefully we won't have it again, even though as our country divides, it looks like we're splintering along the lines where we could have more storm, even in that way. Well, maybe enough about storms tonight, but it all came together, and I thought it would be a good way to get back into being here in Upshur County again, where my roots are, and I'm going to show you some slides in the future, some neat things about the Bible school over there, some neat things happening as a nation of the Philippines. It's growing at about 8 or 9 or 10% a year, as opposed to America, which is probably shrinking right now. And we can talk about reasons for that too. Many of the Filipinos are can-do people like we are in West Virginia. One way to look at the Philippines is they live at the top of the mountains. Of course, the ocean is the deepest in the world there, the trenches around the Philippines, but the mountains are high, 7-8 miles high, just that the tops are showing above the ocean. But anyway, they have the mountaineer spirit, and we'll talk about that in the future. So good to be back. And until the next time, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman thanking you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Special thanks to Channel 3 for the opportunity to come your way each week. See you next week.